We invite now on stage our panelists, Mr. Murtaza Jafaji, Chairman of Advocata Institute, Mr. MHGS Palihakara, former Foreign Secretary and Ambassador to the United Nations, Mr. Suresh Shah, Director General, State-Owned Enterprise Restructuring Unit, and past Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Our commentators for this session, Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja, Visiting Senior Fellow of ODI, Professor Sirmal Aberatna, Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Colombo, and our co-chairman, Mr. P. Gajendra, council member of CMA Sri Lanka, as well as our chairman for this session, Mr. Manil Jayasinghe, past president of the Chartered Accountants of Sri Lanka, and past council member, CMA Sri Lanka, and governing board member of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. I hand the proceedings over now to Mr. Manil Jayasinghe for some opening remarks.
Good morning to all of you all, and welcome back. And I hope that you all are adequately refreshed for the next session. So we are already about 45 minutes late, so we will try to finish this early because that is what will keep you away from your lunch as well. So start off with the topic that we are discussing now is sustaining the reform momentum, which is critical to a lasting recovery. So if you look at what has happened in the last couple of years, we have achieved a tremendous amount of, we have progressed tremendously from where we were in 2022. Now, unfortunately, if you see the statistics, our inflation, which was peaking at about 70%, has now come down to, this month the central bank has announced, to about 1.7%. Then if you look at our GDP, which was negative 7.8 in 22, was negative 2.3, which is improved. And this year, we are forecasting 3%. And first quarter shows a 5.3% in GDP growth. If you look at interest rates, the lending rates, I think, which peaked at about 26%, has fallen. Policy rates has been coming down. Yesterday, I think Governor mentioned, today they have further decreased by 25 basis points. Exchange rate, which peaked at about 360, is now down to about 301, and so on and so forth. Our tourism earnings, which was hovering at a lower rate, has now caught up to some extent, and the other day the newspapers reported that the first half we have done 1.5 billion, so hopefully if we keep that momentum, we'll achieve more than 3 billion. Worker remittances, same issue. We were at a low of 3.7 in 22. We went up to 5.9 in 23. This year, the first half has sort of given us about a 3 billion. So hopefully we will again achieve our growth momentum in those areas. So all these things sometimes makes us wonder whether we should now continue with this reform process. So if I were to quote something from recently announced by Central Bank, it says, now, we have made a formidable recovery of the Sri Lankan economy. This hinges on the continuity of the reform implementation thus far. So we have implemented various things so far. Now the question is, we need to continue with this reform progress, right? There are a few more things. I think our GDP, tax to GDP has also improved, so that that's that fiscal consolidation that's taking place. If you look at our the gross official reserves, which was hovering at 22, statistics show is more than 22 because of the 1.5 million Chinese swap. But if you remove that swap, because that swap is relatively very restricted in use, we didn't have enough reserves at all. Today we have grown these reserves up to 5.6 billion, which includes the 1.5 swap. If you remove the 1.5 swap, we have over 4 billion reserves, which is about 2 months of purchases. So as you can see, this whole path in the last couple of years has been a very tedious task, but it has moved towards some success. But we need to now keep this momentum. So since the country has not fully exited from the crisis, there is no space available for any slippage from the committed path, including some costly policy requirements. So with that, let me just go through our sessions today. We have Murtaza, which is dealing with a very important topic of sustaining reforms, momentum for a strong recovery. Then we have Mr. Palihakara, who will touch on the impact of geopolitics in sustaining this reform momentum and a strong momentum for a strong recovery. And then finally, we have Suresh Shah, who will delve into reviving growth with shaping transformation. And then after that, we will have panel session where we have two panelists, which is Dr. Ganesh Vignaraja and Professor Srimal Abhiratna. So with that, may I hand over to Murtaza, who will take us through the sustaining reform momentum.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I've been given 25 minutes. I'll try to reduce the length of my presentation because we are starting quite late and like to reduce the length of the session. If you can see my slide, I call this presentation "Stick to the Playbook. Experimentation will be disastrous." This is, do you know the official name of our country? Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. And I've highlighted the word socialist. The way I understand it is that no one gets left behind and you have a safety net. Democracy means that you have a franchise. And republic means that the rule of law, that all people are protected by the law. Now let us take a dimension of the economic crisis that we have gone through. Did you know last year in 2023, the Sri Lankan population contracted? This is the first time in modern Sri Lanka's history that our population contracted. We had 80,000 less babies being born, 40,000 more people who died. And if you add the net migration out of the country, there were about 300,000 people who left the country, but of course some element of that comes back. This is the reason why our population contracted. Now, in 2023, a middle-income country in which calls itself the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka has 40,000 more people who are dying. And 80,000 more people, less babies born in the country, which tells you the human dimension of this crisis. We also have an aging population. A demographic dividend, we have lived through a demographic dividend. A demographic dividend was happening in the 1990s and the 2000s, the peak of our conflict. So today, we have a population that will age, and the number of people who are entering the working age population is not no longer growing faster than the rate at which our population is growing. Of course, if you take the fact that it contracted last year, it will grow. But prior to last year, the rate of expansion of our working population slowed. So I put to you a slide of the projections of demographic age groups. What is called the old category, above 75 years, is expected to grow by 5% in the next 5 years. The population above the age of 60 to 74 is expected to grow at 2%. Remember, our population is not growing, and even when it was growing at about 0.8%. So these, because of the transformation, these age cohorts are growing significantly faster. And the reason for this is that 40% of your life cycle's health cost happens after the age of 65. So you have a significant burden to the public sector, which only covers 50% of total healthcare expenditure going forward. Right? Poverty, that there are multidimensional indicators of poverty. On certain indicators, we were below 5%, and some estimates say that it is as high as 25%. This is an estimate done by the IMF. This is based on something like $3.65 spent a day. Right? This is the gravity of the crisis that we have gone through. Now, at the moment, all the indicators are quite favorable. Manila alluded to some. For example, inflation at 1.7, the interest rates at single digit, the currency has appreciated by 7%, last quarter GDP growth was above 5%, the PMIs are above 50, the workers' remittances are going up, tourism is going up, even electricity consumption is going up. We got lucky with the weather. If you remember back to the Yahapalana government days, 2016 and the first half of 2017, there were 3 back-to-back droughts. We haven't had a major drought since then. Last year was an El Nino year, but because of an event called the Indian Ocean Dipole, where the west side of the Indian Ocean heats up and the east side is cooler, we got buckets of rain in the months of September, October, November, unseasonably high rains. So when we started this year, our reservoirs were full, our irrigation tanks had a lot of water. The Maha season basically was good. So it was fortuitous circumstances and a rebound from an extreme crisis with the correct kind of economic policies, which were mainly that they allowed prices to reflect scarcity value, including the cost of money, which is the interest rate. That was a stabilizing factor, but you needed political courage to allow that to happen. And all kudos to both the leaders and the bureaucrats to have done it. Now the issue is, just outside this hotel, there was a Aragalaya movement, a struggle. They called for system change. Unfortunately, very little of the system has changed. What were the roots of this crisis? Highly divisive politics since independence based on ethno-religious nationalism. Elite capture, country that is run for the benefit of 1,000 people. Excess power concentrated with the president. Our presidency is designed for a Lee Kuan Yew, but for every Lee Kuan Yew there are 50 Robert Mugabes. A flawed electoral system, very large electorates which require a lot of money to be in politics. Typical electorate in Sri Lanka should be 100,000 to 120,000 people. But our politicians compete on a district level. Colombo district has 1.7 million voters. It's 700 square kilometers. So you need a lot of money to play this game. And you have to even compete against your own people in the Manapa system. It's the wrong rules of the game. So you get bad outcomes. Populist politics, the famous auction of non-existing resources. Weakened and missing institutions. The most weakened institution is a civil service. I have volunteered time to be on certain committees, and we can see that the deficiencies. This is not the great Ceylon civil service that the British left us with. A population that is poorly informed on civic and economic matters. That is why I have volunteered time in a think tank called Advocata, whose mandate is to improve economic literacy. So don't need to get into the economics here, but I want to explain a very basic thing. A current account deficit is basically your savings investment gap. The reason why we have these large current account deficits and we have a collapse in the currency is not, as commonly thought, that we don't export enough. The problem is there is too much of consumption, there's too much of investment. And the reason we have too much of consumption is there's excess amount of consumption happening at the government, and we have too much of investment happening. That leads to excess demand, which creates this repeated balance of payment crisis. So going forward, I'll come to that. And you've got to also understand where the income is distributed. So the top 10% of households get something like 36% of the income. The top 20% get 51%. The bottom gets very little. So it's those top 20% of households basically that are creating this excess demand. Now the problem is we have a lot of debt. At the peak we had 128% of GDP public debt. We have done restructurings, but even this year it is estimated that our public debt to GDP is 115%. Now there is no red line what it should be, but it is commonly thought that a middle income market access country like Sri Lanka, it should be 60%. And this graph, what it is showing you is a trajectory of the decline in debt. And even at the end of 10 years, it is expected to be 95%, which is yet very high. Now these are fan charts. This shows you probabilistic scenarios. And if we have a shock that comes, we will veer off the path. So quite literally, we don't have wiggle room. Right? That is why I said, we don't stick to the path. We don't have any room for experimentation. Now we did debt restructuring. But in a country that says Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka, we restructured the domestic debt for the people who couldn't argue back. But the thing is that a lot of this high-yielding debt, out of the 9 trillion of bonds that were issued, about 1.9 trillion was issued at yields of 27%. So although the superannuation funds held 43% of the total bonds, they didn't hold 43% of the high-yielding bonds. It was held by private people, it was held by banks, it was held by insurance companies, it was held by primary dealers. So I am estimating, because I don't have details, only 22% of those high-yielding bonds, because all the bonds outstanding had an average of 13. The legacy bonds were at 10. These high-yieldings were at 27. All of that didn't get restructured. So the 2.7 trillion of interest that we are paying, there's about 250 to 300 billion interest on those high-yielding bonds that didn't get restructured. And some of these go up till 2032. So we have a lot of interest. Now the thing is that interest basically is compounding at a very high rate, because one measure of debt to GDP, one measure of debt sustainability is the debt divided by GDP. So your debt basically is compounding at a faster rate than your economy is capable of growing. So even though we are hoping to finish an external debt restructuring, the value recovery option that we had to put in, the debt, the haircut that we will get on our principal will be more like 15%. So okay, we stretch the problem out after 2028, but it is a tall order. We also have very large external liabilities. Our net liabilities are like 60% of GDP. And the IMF has recommended that we have to reduce from 60% of GDP to 30% of GDP. So remember what I said, that current accounts come due to excess amount of demand. The only way to control excess amount of demand is through tight fiscal policy and tight monetary policy. So you can't now excessively stimulate through loose monetary policy and loose fiscal policy, because we're carrying too much of debt. We don't have any room. Now there has been changes. We have a new central bank law which explicitly prohibits monetary financing, which means money printing. No money printing means your real interest rates are going to be high. And we have a primary mandate of the central bank which has been changed. I don't know what the governor said, but he has said this before. His primary mandate is not about economic growth. It's about price stability. And the agreement is to keep inflation at 5%. And I would think that one of the reasons they reduced interest rates yesterday because inflation was going below the boundaries. Right? So when you say 5%, if you're getting it at 2%, you have to still keep it closer to 5%. That means you're having too tight a monetary policy. So you have a very different institution, very different animal that is now operating than you had before. So that era of loose monetary policy and a free-falling currency is hopefully behind us. Now the thing is that even with the IMF's base case projections, to get back to where we were in 2018, it is estimated that it will take us 2026 at this 3% projection. So quite literally, Sri Lanka is going through what is called a lost decade. Now we also had a lot of credit growth during this period. The credit growth has now contracted. This chart is showing you. Now the thing is that the growth had slowed, and what this chart shows you, the step function at the top basically is nominal GDP. And this is coming from the post-conflict era. But growth was slowing down in Sri Lanka. But land prices were going up. Land was the best performing asset class. Now all this credit was going somewhere, but it was certainly not going into productive investments because the growth was not coming through. But asset prices were going up. And the underlying collateral of most of this lending, about 50% is immovable property. And now see where the NPLs are. The size of the bubble, there is totally about 1.4 trillion of NPLs. The size of the bubble is an indication of the size of the NPL, the absolute size of the NPLs. The y-axis is the percentage NPL, and the x-axis is the share of total loans. So you can see where the bubbles are big. These are all non-tradable sectors with high asset intensity. Right? So now we have to clean up this mess. Now the message I want to give here is the type of growth that Sri Lanka will need is productivity-driven growth. You cannot do factor accumulation where you're borrowing from overseas and investing, nor giving non-existing jobs. We have to create jobs. The demographics doesn't say that we have a lot of people coming into the labor force, but we have a lot of women because the women participation rate is only 35%. The male participation rate is 70%. Now, in order to create the right kind of jobs, we will have to create many firms. You will have to create 2 million jobs so that you displace 1 million of existing low productivity jobs and take a labor force which is only 8.5 million people to at least 9.5 million people, you will have to create 2 million new jobs. Which means you will probably have to create 100,000 new establishments or firms. The second thing is you will have to improve productivity, especially what is called total factor productivity, which comes through improving skills, through technological progress and changing the business models. If you look at the growth, and this is the Asian Productivity Organization, the growth over a long period of time, 20 years, was not based on total factor productivity. It came on the back of factor accumulation. Now the factor accumulation method is not going to be able to drive growth going forward because we don't have resources. Ability to borrow is now going to be restricted. In our banking sector, more than 55% of total credit is going to the government. So what's left for the private sector is 45. And don't forget that enormous amount of debt that is at very high interest rates have to be rolled over. So the money that is lent to the government plus the interest cannot be directed somewhere else. That will have to continue to be rolled over. It's only incremental savings that comes in that can be redirected. Now our growth basically was not based on tradable sectors, right? It was based on non-tradable sectors. And let me show you something. This is Sri Lanka's exports on the left, Sri Lanka's imports on the right. Look at the picture. So the difference in the two is the remittances and service income that funded most of this difference. But look at another phenomenally successful country. This is the growth of Vietnam. That over the same 15 years, look where their exports went and look where their imports went. So the message here is, in order for you to export, you need to import. It's a nonsensical argument to say that, no, we will protect domestic industries and encourage exports. It doesn't work like that, because a typical firm can only add 30% value, right? So you've got to buy 70% of the items from outside. Now, we are in a region of the world that does not trade a lot within the region. And many other regions, intra-regional trade is the major trade. But in South Asia, we don't trade. So the message is that we must be open to trade. And anti-trade buzz is not going to work. And trade will make us more competitive. It will increase productivity, because trade means competition. Right? Our current policies never benefited the Sri Lankan consumer, never benefited many business people. It benefited a handful of people. I said this country, the elite capture problem, the fact that this country is run for the benefit of 1,000 people. We also need a full-time finance minister. These colors here are cross-party. And what these graphs are showing, the dark blue is the size of the primary balance deficits. The gray lines are the interest. Now, for the last 20 years, basically, almost like 2/3 of the time, we don't have a full-time finance minister. I'm talking to basically accountants. How can you run a company without a full-time CFO? This country basically for years runs without a full-time finance minister. Because a finance minister is a very unpopular guy. He has to tax people and reduce spending. You can't have the political leader to be the finance minister. And finally, basically, I am not echoing the president's words here, but I had the opportunity to go to Germany. And the president has been talking about the social market economy. But intellectually, it is highly appealing to me as well. Because the success of Germany was a system that they adopted after World War II. Government's role is not to be a player. The government's role is to be a policy maker. It has to be the referee. It has to be the regulator. It sets the policy. Leave it to the private sector to be the players. Because I can tell you, I've worked in committees. I'm a member with Suresh on the SOE restructuring committee. There is a zero case for government to own SOEs. It is a huge drag on the productivity of the country. Because I've been in investments for 30 years. And besides all the other analysis that I do, the most important analysis that matters is who are the owners. Because when you buy a piece of a business, you want to align with good owners. Owners who care for the business, who want a return, who talk about ROE. So fundamentally, if we are going to come out of this issue, we need our government to withdraw from being a player in the economy and being a policy maker and a regulator. Because our state capacity is limited. So whatever talent that we have to direct it in the right type of governance and not try to do things you cannot do. So I will like to conclude my presentation and say that we have zero room to experiment. It is likely, and there was an IMF study from 1978 to 2010, which says that emerging market issuers, there's a 58% probability that people who defaulted will default again. So we are still carrying a lot of debt. We don't have a demographic dividend. Our population is aging, less babies born, more people dying. So far, we have come on the right path. We have zero room to experiment.
Thank you, Murtaza, for that, I think, thought-provoking and in-depth analysis. I hope we also move towards what you're saying, but the question is, the political will be there. So let's hope that happens the best. So with that, I think on some of the comments that Murtaza made also, we move on to the next session, which is ideally placed, in order to understand about the impact of what geopolitics has to play in this sustaining the reform momentum. When you know, as a country, we are always in between some of these geopolitical conflicts or whatever you want to call it. So I think for that we have Mr. Palihakara, a former Foreign Secretary and an ambassador to the United Nations, who will probably give his views and take us through that area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. After such a hard-nosed and a very pointed presentation, the word geopolitics may sound rather abstract to you, but I think some of the deficits that Mr. Jafferji referred to have triggered major geopolitical problems for Sri Lanka, including for our economic growth, governance, accountability, and so forth, so forth. I will try to refer to some of these within the limited time here. First, let me say that we in Sri Lanka now suffer many hardships. Obvious among them are three fatigues, I would say: crisis fatigue, the reform fatigue, and not the least, the analysis fatigue. I hope I will not add to that last fatigue in my remarks, but because we seem to have an abundance of analysis, but are confronted with a paucity of agreed solutions. I emphasize the word agreed or consensual. On a way forward, especially, towards a sustainable growth path, anchored in a prudent reform regime. Why? Because the stark reality is that if the crisis was painful, the reforms needed for recovery are equally painful, even maybe even excruciating, actually. Hence my emphasis on a consensual reform regime. That's how other countries, ranging from India to Italy to Greece, and to name only a few, either prevented such crises from happening or recovered after such crises. Unfortunately for us, the kind of hapless people of Sri Lanka, leaders from all sides in this country have failed once again to reach a common understanding on the imperative of reforms and the substance of reform. Instead, we seem to have, at least our politicos, not we, the citizens, politicos on all sides have opted to expose this, what I would call the existential requirement of reform, to the how shall I say, unforgiving affair called the election politics and horse trading in a very controversial election campaign. Consequently, we have enforced reform, not consensual reform. Important to remember this. This lacuna, the political malaise, spawns several concerns. Firstly, it suggests a degree of uncertainty and unpredictability of the trajectory and the future of reform. Secondly, external inputs, which are clearly needed for recovery process, is becoming more prescriptive or maybe even punitive at times. The latest report by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, 1 week ago actually, to the ongoing session in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, already suggests this unprecedented line of action towards Sri Lanka, even in the context of the reform restructuring under the IMF auspices. I have not seen in my working life such an approach in regard to any other similarly placed country. And lastly, it can once again open windows for intrusive geopolitical pressures, constraining our freedom of choice in public policy and in governance, as our creditors also try to follow suit, trying to formulate their own medium and long-term approach to Sri Lanka's problems in relation to their own financial and strategic interests. The forthcoming elections have already become controversial. If and when they are held, they may change some phases, but not clear how much else. This is because it is also not yet clear whether the outcome of election bring about a more constructive and consensual approach to a consistent reform regime, or whether it will aggravate the prevailing kind of adversarial approach of reform hardships being used in the polemics of regime change. So this is not clear. I hope I am not sounding very negative, but these are the realities that an outsider will take into account in dealing with us. So it is in this context we have to look at the impacts of geopolitics on the recovery reform effort here. Sri Lanka at this juncture, I think Mr. Jafferji's points, the governor's points has indicated, has reached a degree of stability with some economic and financial indicators showing good work in progress. There is also a reasonable outcome, I would say, in negotiations with bilateral and plus multilateral creditors, as well as with the all-important non-state ISB people, ISB creditors. This happened despite a volatile election season that is looming large, and despite the uncertainties we just discussed. This good work by the government and our negotiators need to be appreciated. However, the breathing space thus obtained cannot and should not be misconstrued as an assured pathway to sustainable growth. It won't happen without a political consensus committed to a consistent and continued reform effort over the long haul. I think the governor referred to this briefly. Why do I say that? There are things happening now indicative of what can come. Usual election polemics about undeliverable promises are being heard again. There is unhinged trade union activity, not necessarily dictated by the ILO's collective bargaining principle, but by parochial interests, unhinged trade union activity. The other disruptive street manifestation. So also the state's propensity to respond to them, these disruptions, by using water cannons and forceful suppression as a substitute for negotiations. All those things don't paint a pretty picture, actually. So these already signal the perils of enforced reforms as against consensual reforms. Such reforms that decimate the vulnerable. On the other hand, I think the poverty data you just showed indicate that vulnerable segments of society and multiply poverty can bring about more instability and no agreed pathways. the rising poverty statistics cited by the UNDP, if accurate, are quite depressing and even alarming. So in support of this same reformist line, so to speak, what I will therefore attempt in the minutes available is why it is in Sri Lanka's national interest to do consensual reforms as against enforced reform, even from a perspective of geopolitics and negotiating the external inputs required to advance the recovery growth process beyond the current status quo. Current status quo being, in my mind, an inflection point at which Sri Lanka seems to be rather delicately placed at this point. First, very quickly, what is geopolitics? I don't want to go into academic discussion. The term itself was to be a coinage by a Swedish political scientist at the turn of the last century. Suffice it to say here, for our this discussion purpose, that geopolitics is no better or no worse than local politics. No pun intended here. Geopolitics represent doctrines, policies and practices by major powers to advance their own interests by the use or threat of use of power, often at the expense of some others' interests. Basically, it's a power-based manipulations. Countries that hop from crisis to crisis due to bad macroeconomics and fiscal indiscipline like Sri Lanka are particularly vulnerable. Multilateral system entities like the IMF, World Bank, and the other of the Bretton Woods system have ancillary roles in this geopolitical framework. They won't admit it publicly, but it is the reality. So it should be clear to you that Sri Lanka crisis fits in here as a telling case study. So geopolitics has been and will be a factor to reckon with as a cohesive international politics. So why bother about geopolitics or externalities? After all, it's our economy and our work here. If we get it right here, we can't go wrong abroad, and so forth. Yes, in an ideal world, yes, but not necessarily in the real world. We cannot grow or develop ourselves in isolation. The playing field is uneven, and the world is asymmetric. That's why. So basically, the Oxford Handbook of Modern Diplomacy, we are going back to our traditional source of wisdom, England and Oxford, it says domestic policy objectives cannot be achieved independently of what is happening in the global economy or of the policies of other countries. Economic diplomacy is all about reconciling domestic and international policy objectives in an increasingly interdependent, if not globalized economy. So the home truth embedded in this diplomatic jargon is simple, that the high moral ground of a rules-based international order being talked about by big powers, that notwithstanding, we should be pragmatic enough to reconcile our policy objectives with those of other countries. Translation of this is we need to reckon with geopolitical power players. So in its broader sense, geopolitics have and will interact with both the causes as well as the recovery from Sri Lanka's economic crisis. So I don't want to go into details. I think our time constraints are there. The US and US-led West and India plus some analysts in Sri Lanka opine that principal contributor to the crisis was Chinese debt trap, as they call it. Obviously, this view is connected to very complex strategic calculations by the Western countries and by India for managing and containing the phenomenal rise of China as an economic powerhouse and a major global player. But this is disputed by, of course, China and even by Sri Lanka. this crisis is more due to our own failings and deficits and so forth. That is at the beginning of our crisis. Now the complexity of all these considerations relevant to the beginning of our crisis are best understood by looking at perceptions by the major power. Firstly, negotiating crisis recovery and reaching sustainable growth require not only sound economic analysis but also careful diplomacy to corral key creditors onto a common platform beneficial to us. But this is caught up in the triangular rivalry, competition among the US-led West, plus India on one side and China on the other. Now, then India would like to frame what it calls its generous financial assistance to Sri Lanka during the crisis as an expression of what it sees as a legitimate sphere of influence in the region, particularly South Asia. Accordingly, the Indian assistance may in fact necessitate or require strategic and geopolitical quid pro quos from Sri Lanka. What form it will take is not yet clear. Maybe the agreement signed by our president and India recently, when they become fully available, maybe we will know what they are. Thirdly, the Western Indian creditors claim that China came on board debt restructuring common ground for Sri Lanka because of their pressure on China, especially the core of the Paris Club was that those group of countries. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, Mr. Donald Lu, said as much during his last visit here. He said it publicly, actually. So this somewhat tangled web of permutations or considerations signify a complex mix of foreign relations, geopolitics, and economic interests. As I said, this notwithstanding, government has done reasonably well so far to navigate the debt restructuring stretch. So in this situation, what should we do? Do we enter the fray or remain neutral? This is a long debate. But having looked at the geopolitics and the causes, let me look at a few points about the recovery part of it. Firstly, it's not rocket science to know that if we do not muster enlightened reforms and a political consensus on it, and if reforms fail or reforms decimate the vulnerable, instability and crisis can recur. If we do not reckon with this reality, whatever the cosmetic changes that the promised but yet uncertain elections may or may not bring will be of little relevance. And no major geopolitical player or a serious investor will want this strategic hub to be crisis hopping forever, even if they don't harbor military-based aspirations here. Also, as a result, more intrusive external interventions in our governance can happen. Secondly, Sri Lanka, as I said, already under severe and continuing scrutiny and aggressive prescriptions on many of our national affairs by the UN Human Rights Council, especially on our long-running issues with accountability, reconciliation, and governance. So there are a number of resolutions by the UNHCR on it, and some of our major economic problems arose out of the absence of accountability in the country. And secondly, India will have its own strategic interest in ensuring a stable Sri Lanka, remaining within what it perceives as its sphere of influence, particularly at this juncture when India itself is exploring and defining its role in the world. This is Indian Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar put it as India's transition from balancing power to a leading power. India has a concern or even a fear about Sri Lanka. Whether this is ill-founded or well-founded is another matter, a debatable one even. But it does have a concern that an unstable and crisis-prone Sri Lanka can fall prey to a power that is inimical to its interests and global aspirations. So what is even more important is that Sri Lanka has its own intrinsic interest in strong reform-backed recovery as a prudent via media to modulate into Sri Lanka economic cooperation in a way that will not compromise our sovereign autonomy of making independent decisions concerning public policy and economic development. This we have to make a distinction between economic cooperation with India and economic integration with India. Latter has grave implications. I have no time to go into that. So Sri Lanka is a case study of unwelcome and unwarranted experiences in this regard in terms of geopolitics. How does one prevent or at least minimize such unwelcome things and retain our strategic and sovereign autonomy? Two things stand out. First, reform of a malfunctioning system in accordance with the rule of law. Not rule of men, but the rule of law. Second, right people asking right questions at the right time, be it in public governance or corporate governance. Who are the right people? The public officials in the former and the professionals in the latter, including those of you and we who are gathered here at this important CMA domain. If this does not happen and domestic deficits and in accountability continue, whether due to corrupt politics or malfunctioning system or even corrupt clients, irrespective of that, crisis can recur and deficits could continue. Again, it will create space for geopolitical interference, be it under the guise of external assistance, friendly help, accountability, or human rights. This, in essence, is the fundamental the interplay between geopolitics or reforms or the absence of it. So, but let me conclude on a positive note. We are supposed to be a multi-branch democratic government system with clear separation of powers, with attendant checks and balances. With some landmark determination in recent time, the judicial branch of this multi-branch system has taken the lead in asking, could I have one more minute? Asking some probing questions and taking some robust action against brightening hopes for revitalizing accountability. Sri Lanka crisis in its broadest sense was and remains a crisis of accountability that evaded our domestic regulatory system. It is time for the executive and the legislative arms in both the public and corporate sectors, therefore, to take the cue from the judiciary and follow suit. They can and should ask those probing and maybe even uncomfortable questions relevant to their mandates without waiting for the politicos to deliver, because we know what their track record is. So if an enlightened reform project does not materialize on a system-wide basis, chasing the lenders of last resort, yet again at the butt end of interference by geopolitical forces, not on our own volition, in the neighborhood and the far-flung places will again become a strong possibility. Sri Lanka needs to avoid it being branded as a country of crisis proclivity. It is doable through consensual reforms. Whatever happens or doesn't happen prior to or at the elections, the politicos must get their act together to build that common ground. The public service and professional like the CMA partners can and should provide the necessary institutional prodding towards it. That's the best shot professionals like us can take at averting cyclical crises. Thank you, and I hope I did not add to your analysis fatigue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Palyakar, for that thought-provoking presentation. Now we move on to our last presentation, which is reviving growth to shaping transformation, and we have none other than Mr. Suresh Shah to take us through that. I'm sure that in everyone's mind is in the area which he is specializing in. So we will listen to him, see how we can keep this growth momentum through reviving growth through shaping transformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Manil. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'll start with the number 95%. And this is an important number because what it represents is Sri Lanka's debt to GDP ratio in 2032. And that is after we've done everything that we should have done based on the IMF program and so on and so forth. So if we get everything right, by 2032, our debt to GDP ratio is 95%, which is still extremely high. So fundamentally what this means is that Sri Lanka is still, notwithstanding the significant improvement we've seen in the economy of the country since 2021, 2022, notwithstanding those improvements, we are still on a knife's edge. And why do I say we are on a knife's edge? Because some incident outside Sri Lanka over which we have absolutely no control over. So if some terrorist group, for example, blows up an oil pipeline somewhere and the price of oil goes through the roof, because our debt number is still so high, Sri Lanka will be in deep trouble. So ladies and gentlemen, this is the first thing that all of us got to keep in mind. We are on a knife's edge. So I think I take very much Murtaza's point that this is not a time for experimentation. We can experiment when things are going well, but not when things are going badly. That's number one. Number two, just think of this. If a country goes to the IMF once, that could very well be because some external factors have impacted us, factors beyond our control. If a country goes to the IMF twice, it kind of starts to tell you that the economic management of the country is not very good. If the country goes to the IMF 3 times, it tells you that the economic management of the country is probably quite bad. Now you ask yourself, if a country goes to the IMF 17 times, what does that tell you? You think of this, every one of you, I think, are in the private sector and involved with some business or the other. If you go to the bank when you're in trouble, once, yes, they will look at you and they will help you out. If you go twice, yes, they might still put a little few strictures here and there, but they will still look at you. If you start going 3 and 4 times, they'll probably not let you through the front door. But Sri Lanka has gone to the IMF 17 times. What does that tell you? That the economic management of our country has been disastrous. Let's not beat around the bush. Now, for those of you who think that Sri Lanka doesn't know economics and how to manage its economy, that we don't have people who think about economics well, I ask you to go back to a document. This is available on the internet. It's called Regain Sri Lanka. This document, ladies and gentlemen, was prepared in 2002, 22 years ago. And if you read that document, a lot of what that document tells you is applicable even today. So what this tells you is it tells you that Sri Lanka knows what it needs to do, but unfortunately, we've not had the will or the discipline to get it done. And there is a good reason for this. The reason is that there is nothing called an economy. You know, don't listen to what the economists tell you. There is nothing that's called an economy. What you do have is a political economy. Because whatever decisions you take in politics has an impact on an economy, and whatever decision you take on the economic side has an impact on the politics. This is the reality. So we live in a political economy. Now, those countries that have succeeded and moved forward and made their people rich and wealthy and prosperous are those countries that have compromised on the side of economics when there is a conflict between politics and economics. And there is always a conflict between politics and economics. So those countries that have compromised on the side of the politics, and Singapore is a brilliant example of this, those countries have progressed, they've developed, their people have been wealthy, their people have become wealthy and prosperous. And those countries that have compromised on the side of politics, when there is a confrontation between economics and politics, those countries have suffered. And Sri Lanka is one of those countries. And if you look around the world and if you look at the countries that are not prosperous, you will see this as a thread that runs throughout all these nations. Now, if you take Sri Lanka, one of the fundamental reasons why there is this compromise that's happening on the political side rather than on the economic side is because amongst the major political parties of our country, there isn't a consensus, a broad consensus. I'm not saying a detailed consensus, but a very broad consensus in terms of how the country needs to be moved forward. So we've all witnessed in our lifetime when a political party is in power and they list out certain policies, they say these are the things that we need to do. It can be on economics, it can be on any other thing, it can be on the national question, for example. But when they go to the opposition, they completely change. And those in opposition who have opposed everything that a party in power does, they get into power and then they try to do the same thing. Now, unless we build this very broad consensus as to how we need to move the country forward, we will never have economic growth and we will never reach prosperity in this country. So we got to change our mindset. This is really important. And an indicator of the country's economy and the country's economic development is seen in another one statistic, which is the level of FDI that Sri Lanka has received. We have never ever in any one single year received FDI of $2 billion. Not in any one year. Now, just to give you a comparison, in 2022, Indonesia received $21 billion of FDI. Vietnam had 18 billion. Thailand had 10. And a country like Cambodia had 3.5 billion of FDI in 2022. Sri Lanka never ever achieved $2 billion. What does that tell you? So we got to completely rethink the approach that we have on the economic side in our country. And so let me give you a few indicators of what we need to do. How do we need to progress as we move forward? The first thing that we have to do is we have to build an economy that creates employment. I think Murtaza during his presentation said that we have given employment, and that is the truth. What we have done is we've given employment. That's why you see the public service overblown the way it is. We have given employment. We have not created employment. If we had created employment, that employment would be within the private sector, and the private sector employee numbers would be much greater than what we have. So we got to have an environment that is conducive, that encourages investment. That means ease of doing business. So this is one of the most important things that we need to do, number one. Number two, we need to take ministerial discretion out of the system. Today, ministers in this country have an incredible amount of discretion. And what happens when there is ministerial discretion is when the private sector needs to get something done, you don't have a rule-based system to get it done. Instead, you have to approach a politician to get it done. And this is the nexus, this is the point at which the corruption starts. So we need to break this. And the way to do that is to move away from having this system of discretion to a system of rule-based administration. That is number 2. Number 3, ladies and gentlemen, is education. If I remember my numbers right, my numbers may not be right, but you get an idea of what I'm saying. I think we have around 150 or 160,000 students who qualify for university. They qualify for university. But the number that actually gets into university is only about 40,000. What happens to the rest? You know, Murtaza made the point, the name of our country, there is a term called socialist. How is this possible if only 40,000 of the students, of the 160,000 students who qualify, if only 40,000 get into university? How can we take people out of poverty? How can we give the younger generation hope in this country unless we give them a good education? We are depriving our students of a good education by restricting their ability to get into university. And why is it that they can't get into university? Because we don't have the physical infrastructure required. That is simply what it is. We don't have sufficient space in our campuses. We don't have sufficient teachers. We haven't invested behind our education system to allow the children who actually qualify for university to get into university. And this brings me to a point which I'm very familiar with because of the work that we do. One of the issues that we have in this country, and it's this issue of thinking. You know, we say that these state-owned enterprises that we have are national assets. Jatika Sampat is the term that is used. And I mean, these are commercial enterprises. And let me tell you that I come from the private sector. I have been in the private sector for many years. And let me tell you that there is no commercial enterprise in this country, whether it is state-owned or whether it is private-owned, which is a national asset. Because the way I define a national asset is an asset that can help transform Sri Lanka. And there is no single entity in this country. It can be any firm that you think of, any commercial enterprise that can transform Sri Lanka. Instead, the true national assets of this country, number 1, our younger generation. You invest in our younger generation, teach them the right values, give them the right education, they will transform Sri Lanka. That's where we need to invest, not in Sri Lankan Airlines. So number 1 national asset is our younger generation. The second national, and this is not in any order of priority, the second national asset that I can tell you is our irrigation system. You think about it. We harness rainwater and then we take it to the last acre of a farmer. This is an incredible asset that we have. And if we leverage this asset, just think of the benefit that the agriculture sector can derive out of this irrigation system that we have. But we haven't invested in that irrigation system. We haven't maintained it well. We have not leveraged it. Instead, we go and invest in the Sri Lanka Insurance Corporation. The third national asset is our maritime resources. Our maritime boundaries are 3 times the size of our land mass. How much investment have we done in our maritime resources? We have not. A friend of mine once said that we let the fish in our oceans die of old age. We've not invested in our maritime assets. Instead, we've gone and invested it in some company or the other. Why? Because we think these commercial enterprises are our national assets. Instead, what we've done is we've not put our resources into where our true national assets are. So we need to change our mindset. We need to really understand what our national assets are, and those are the assets that can transform this country, and we need to put our investments, our resources. And when I say resources, I'm not just talking only about funds, but I'm also talking about the right people, the right time, the right policies, and so on and so forth. So these are the things that we need to invest in. Let me also just take a few minutes to explain to you the damage that the state-owned enterprise sector has done to Sri Lanka. All of us, until a few years ago, benefited from subsidized fuel. Every one of us. Now, as a result of this subsidy, the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation showed a huge loss in its balance sheet. But for a minute, don't believe that that subsidy was parked in the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. Why? Because a company that makes that kind of loss simply cannot survive unless there is an infusion of cash. The government did not have the cash to infuse. So what did the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation do? It goes to the two state banks with a treasury guarantee and says, can I have some money? And the state banks lend the money to the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, right? Similarly, Sri Lankan Airlines, same story. It goes to the state banks with a treasury guarantee, and the state banks fund the Sri Lankan Airlines. Now, neither Sri Lankan Airlines nor the CPC nor, for example, the CEB pays those loans back. So where does the subsidy get parked? The subsidy is parked in the two state banks. And whose money does the state bank have? Government funds? No. It is your funds, because as depositors, it is your money that is in the state bank. So your depositors' funds have been used to subsidize the petrol prices or the energy prices that we've had in the past. And this has put the entire financial system at risk. So these are the wrong policies that we've followed in the past, which we need to correct. And unless we have a complete rethink, and that's what reform is all about. Reform is all about a rethink, not doing things that we've done in the past, but doing things very differently going forward. So ladies and gentlemen, let me finish with this summary. If we want our future to be any different from what our past has been, then we need to do things very differently than what we've done in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suresh, for that very interesting and thought-provoking session. Just a couple of things I just want to say that number of people who get through A-levels is about 190, so your problem gets worse. Just to say that. And also about the state banks, how it happens is not that they go with the treasury guarantee, they say that the ship is outside, we don't have money to clear the ship. And if you don't clear the ship, country doesn't have oil. So that is how they force the state banks to actually part with the money. So they put, I think, sort of mental pressure, psychological pressure on various institutions. And I'm glad that Suresh raised this point. These are very vital points, and I think moving forward in this reform agenda, and if you want to see the country grow, I think some of these things need to happen. So with that, let's move on to our sort of panel discussion, where if I may invite Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja to probably share his thoughts about the three presentations and also about sustaining this reform momentum.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be at CMA, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Chair. I think we had a lot of food for thought from the three main presenters. Let me try to respond to a few of the points that they made under the headings of geopolitics, particularly what Mr. Palyakara said. I'll talk a little bit about the current scenario, what Murtaza talked about, and then future policy, what Suresh talked about. And these are all my friends, so I have to be careful, but I'm going to spice it up a little bit. For Mr. Palyakara, you did talk about geopolitics and domestic policy, particularly reform. I want to pick up on a couple of points. First is on the China debt trap issue. This is, as you kind of rightly allude, this is partly true, Mr. Palekara. When you look at the debt owed to China, it was about, I think they're the largest bilateral creditor to Sri Lanka and hold a huge part of our debt. And so it doesn't quite show up, some 15%, I think, when we defaulted in 2022. So that doesn't look so big. But the problem really is this mix of a few good projects, like the terminal in Colombo Port, which is quite decent, compared to all the low return white elephant projects, right? And they, as Suresh just said, adds to our debt, right? So we have an airport that doesn't work and hasn't worked for years. We have a port that's not at capacity. And so there is a real problem there about, not doing proper infrastructure master planning, not doing cost-benefit analysis of projects, right? Having cabinet approval without any technical analysis done by the Ministry of Finance. So it's really our fault. I mean, and the Chinese were very generous in giving us money, knowing the political economy of Sri Lanka. So that's on the debt trap issue. On the part where you were a little bit pessimistic or about the international community, the international community, Mr. Palekara, quite frankly, have saved us. The Indians gave us 4 billion in aid, which allowed us to feed ourselves and import fuel in 2022. The French and the Japanese are chairing the official creditor committee for Sri Lanka, and Thailand even signed a trade agreement with us. So they have been very generous. My only worry is that we left the ball on our economic security, Mr. Palekara, particularly in 2019 to 2022. And that is really, something in Sri Lanka's history which must remain with all of us as to how the side was let down. And we ourselves let it down. It wasn't the globe, Mr. Palekara, it was ourselves. And that is been very carefully written. So this economic security has to be embedded in every Sri Lankan's mind, that if we don't have foreign reserves, as the governor said this morning, we are in deep trouble. And the day we defaulted, we had $25 million in the central bank. $25 million. And that's the reality. How did an economy like this get to a point where the rulers allowed $25 million in the central bank? So that's the point there. Second, on Murtaza's very interesting points, you rightly said, and also the chair, that we're not out of the woods yet. On the growth side of the story, Murtaza, the range of forecasts, right, goes from 3% by the central bank, somewhat optimistic, to the ADB at 1.9%. The problem is we're not growing fast enough, right? And we need 5 to 6% to repay our debts by getting exports and things up. And we need to raise our productivity significantly. On that, I completely agree. But growth would be both a mixture of accumulation, right? We need different kinds of human capital. That's going to be needed, right? As well as we need to invest in capex. So somewhere in this fiscal problem that we have, we need to reallocate some expenditure, so we are investing in capex, right? And capex has to go up, because if we don't get the incremental capital output ratio up, that will deprive us of a major growth driver, right? So we have to go away from these loss-making enterprises, for instance, one or two items in the spend, to move towards more capex that is sustainable. And I think we talked earlier about renewable energy, for instance, right? So that becomes important. So capex there matters, right? On the related point was about this poverty. Now, the poverty number is interesting, okay? 25% of Sri Lankans, some 5 million are poor. That's one kind of a number. That's based on a projected number, right? The data were collected in 2019, if memory serves me right, and projected through micro-simulation analysis by the World Bank. So it's not quite a real number. The UNDP have this index of deprivation. I think, Sirimal, you were on that task force or something of that type. Half Sri Lanka is deprived, right? So to me, those numbers seem a little bit high, but for sure the poverty number has gone up from the 11% when it was measured properly, right? Whether it's 25% or 50%, I don't know. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The point is that it's creating a lot of dissatisfaction in the country, both with people suffering, but also with the political system and politicians in a year when we have political elections coming up in different forms. So that's a real bubbling issue which everyone has talked about. On the debt restructuring, the panel didn't quite mention this point that in 2028 we have to start repaying the capital payments and the interest payments on the official creditors. So we have 3 or 4 years to begin to turn this round, right? And that, I think, is the most serious issue. That is what I lie awake at night, and I hope all the CMA accountants will do these numbers. So that means we have to generate enough foreign exchange, and I'm sure Murtaza has done the math, so that we can repay the capital and the interest. That's just on the official credit. If we think that the private deal that is in the works with the private bondholder is also happening, we'll have to start repaying the interest, if my memory serves me right, or what I know, from later this year, the interest. And the capital will be 2028, right? So we are going to have in 2028 a real issue if we go back to homegrown solutions and inward orientation and all that nonsense that was done earlier, right? So that should be really underlined. If not, we have sadly, I think it was Murtaza or Suresh who said, not 79 this program, I think 18, 19, and 20 will be there. And you know, and that means all the policy space we want to do, all the wonderful things we all want to do here, we cannot do, right? And that is really what should keep all of us awake at night, and all of us should be lobbying our politicians and saying, what are your plans to get Sri Lanka going again, okay? Now, the last couple of points I want to make is about what Suresh said, which is really on the future. Suresh, I think you're absolutely right. State-owned enterprise becomes critical, fiscal, public sector management becomes critical, but I think we really need a three-pronged strategy, right? We have to try to do as much foreign exchange as we can. We have to do, and that's not debt creating, right? So every time we want to borrow from China or anyone else, we have to put a lot of tests to say what is it that Sri Lanka will benefit before we do that. That's for clear. But we have to really try to get up the tourism. The numbers have to be 2 million, 3 million, some number like that. I don't think we've ever done that, right? So apart from 2 billion FDI, we've never had 2 million tourists. That's a doable thing. Without too much, we have to ensure there's safety of women tourists here. There are awful issues there. We have to ensure that we have the right kind of infrastructure in terms of hotels and so on. We have to price this stuff properly. We have to do the environmental stuff. That is a very doable thing, tourism, okay? The second thing is the remittances, okay? The remittances, again, is doable, but we have to have various measures to make sure that comes, right? And especially now when we are sending out even more people than we ever did before. The exports is really tough, right? We've never had enough exports. And that requires a massive slashing of red tape for a start, leaving everything else. And I think some of these can be done by stroke of the pen. I've always wondered why we need yet another committee to sort out a red tape issue, being it set up a business or something else. We should just do red tape by slashing with stroke of the pen. This is what they did in Georgia, and we should just do that and only introduce those regulations which are really necessary. The third point about this is really the poverty reduction, and I think we mustn't forget that. And for me, the priority really is food security, Suresh. It's not so much even the welfare payments. If we cannot feed our people on fixed incomes, we are in deep trouble. And that is the one exception I take to protecting a sector, to providing whatever is required to get that sector going. Otherwise, we will have this terrible, terrible situation of child malnutrition, which again should keep us all awake at night. This is a country that is proud in its social indicators, and we have really let the side down. So I think we have to look at these things. On the last point, and I have 6 seconds, is about the consensus, and I couldn't agree more, and I think all of us have to do something to make this work. Thank you very much. That's just 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. So we move on to our last commentator, Professor Srimal Apiratna. If you can just sort of comment on the presentation that I made and your general thought.
Thank you for the invite. Thank you, Chairman. Let me give a couple of points as responses to Murtaza, Suresh as well as Mr. Palyakar, taking where they have focus on. Also, why we need growth, as Mutsa said, because your theme of this conference is also about navigating stability and also dynamic economic growth. In fact, in the morning from the governor's speech, you heard that why stability is important to achieve growth. Let me also take you to the point in the other direction, taking the reverse causation. And why we need growth is because Sri Lanka needs to maintain our economic progress beyond recovery. And recovery means we are going back to where we were in 2019 or somewhere there, which is not a good standing point for us as a nation, but we need to go beyond recovery so that we need growth. Secondly, we need growth to avoid the next crisis. And that is an important point. The reason is actually, when we look at the stability numbers, they are all good now and inflation has gone down. Interest rates have been falling. The budget deficit has been under control now, and the tax revenue is on the rise. The primary balance turned positive. We had only a couple of times positive primary balances in the country. And taking one point from Suresh, I also, that's the political economy, but I want to mention that I just remember that each time when we had positive primary balance, at the next election, people changed that government. So we had primary positive balance last year, and elections are around the corner. So these positive achievements in stability has to be maintained with growth, and without growth, you cannot maintain those stability numbers. And we have a breathing space also given by this debt restructuring process. With that, we have a couple of years until 2028, and then after that, low payments. And even with all these things, we will have only 95%. If everything goes right, as Suresh said, we will have 95% of debt of GDP by 2032, right? 2032. It's still difficult target, but if everything goes right, we will have that, but still it is very high also. And the important point about our growth numbers is actually, I'm amazed to think that after 45 years, more than 45 years of open economy, I don't call it an open economy, but rhetorically we say it's an open economy. After 45 years of experience, we have achieved only $12 billion worth exports. And we are sitting among our peers who are talking about 200, 300, 400, 500 billion exports a year. And we have achieved only 12. And in fact, if you look at our growth numbers in the past, and the sources of those growth, as Mursa mentioned, the non-tradable sector, and those sectors that keep our economy growing, they did not generate dollars. So we have been earning rupees, and to earn those rupees, we have also invested, borrowed money from abroad in dollars, and now we have a problem of converting our rupee income into dollars because we have only 12 billion worth exports. So this dilemma has to be sorted out with export growth. That's why actually we need to remove that anti-export bias that has been in this economy, and that's why we need to move forward with reforms to establish our open economy and the export-oriented economy. Suresh also mentioned about the couple of points. Of course, you look at the political economy side. I completely agree with that, and it is easy for us to talk about economics sitting here, but it is not that easy to manage the economy when you are working in a political economy. In fact, he talked about the compromising between these two sides, politics and economics, and that playing with in between these two scenarios is very, very important, very critical. And that's exactly why we, as he mentioned, we had to go to IMF 17 times. In fact, if we want to learn from other country experience, we should look at Thailand. It was in crisis in 1997 because of the collapse of the Thai baht in that financial crisis, East Asian financial crisis, and it went to the IMF. And since then, Thailand has never been to IMF because it continued its reforms. The next country I can also think about is our neighbor, India. India also had a similar problem in 1990 and 1991. It went to the IMF in 1991 and then initiated reforms, continuously, steadily carrying out those reforms until now, and it never went back to IMF again. But we had to go back to IMF 17 times. It is not because of the problem, any problem of the IMF, it is our own problem. So we can learn from our neighbors, and at least we should stop this time, 17th time. Otherwise, if we don't sustain our stability with economic growth, with export growth, obviously, I don't know about the how to avoid the next crisis. That is number one, and I don't know why how to avoid not going to the how to avoid going back to the IMF also. Regarding geopolitics, because I have 2 minutes, let me summarize what I want to say. I think in a crisis like this, if a country is fallen down to this kind of situation now, vulnerability to any kind of superpowers, geopolitics is quite high. So if the answer to stand alone in the face of geopolitics is also that we need to be a strong economy, and without which we cannot avoid that vulnerability, number 1 point. Number 2 point, I think in doing so, we cannot lean on to any superpower because we cannot afford to do that. And our economy should be an open economy which makes everyone to come and compete here on equal terms. Number 2. In fact, my third point is, if you look at the history of geopolitics in this region, also there were a lot of implications on the Sri Lankan development. If you look at those superpower politics in the region, in fact, what we have seen is there are no permanent enemies in geopolitics too. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor. I think we have had a very in-depth discussion, as well as presenters presenting their views on certain areas. So there are certain themes that are coming out very strongly. I think several people mentioned that we need to get out of this discretionary method of approving things to rule-based approval, so that you remove that discretion. If we want foreign investments to come in, we have to increase foreign investments. We have to increase our exports, that's for sure. One other thing that hasn't really come out of this is we are all happy with this gross official reserves at 4 billion or 5 billion, whichever way you want to look at it. But in reality, I think the IMF is saying that when the debt repayments come, our gross reserves should be more in the tune of 10 to 13 billion. So we have basically 3 or 4 years to build up those reserves, and then there is a path to do so. So that's also going to be a critical factor, because if we don't have that, we will get into the same crisis scenario once again. Even today, even at the reserves at it's at 5.6, but minus the Chinese swap, it's at 4 point something, which is only about two months purchases. So clearly there is a lot of work to be done on the reform side. I think education is one area that we successively miss out. One of the key areas that I think this coming out of it, we do get caught in geopolitics because sometimes between China and India, we are stuck in the middle there. One doesn't want us to do something and the other sort of wants us to do it, and then we are stuck. So all these issues are there, but we have steered a difficult path in the last couple of years. So I clearly think that this momentum has to continue. And if it doesn't continue, before long we'll be back into the same slot. Now, of course, all this fight to continue has a political element in this. So I hope whoever is there in governing this country will continue to ensure that we steer in the same direction. So with that, just let me open this out for a few minutes to the if there is any questions, but given the time, and we are sort of I'm sure we are keeping you away from your lunch, we can wind the session.
Thank you. Then myself with my session chairman, Mr. Manil, I would like to thank all the eminent speakers and commentators for accepting our invitation, and my CMP sincere apologies for not able to thank each and every one of you personally because of the time limitation. Thank you.
We'd like to invite Professor Lakshman Vatavalla to present our panelists and chairpersons with tokens of appreciation. We begin with our chairperson, Mr. Manil Jayasinghe. And our co-chair, Mr. P. Gajendra. And our panelists, Mr. Murtaza Jafarji, Mr. Palihakara, Mr. Suresh Shah, Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja, and Professor Abiratna. A photograph is required, so we'll invite everyone to the front of the stage, please. And we invite Mr. Hennayak Bandara too to join them. Thank you. So when the rate of increase of hunger goes too high and the time taken to satisfy it increases, the ability to concentrate decreases, and therefore we'd like to suggest that you take a break